Thank you very much to Anthony and the RIP for giving me this opportunity actually to speak about foot. Like Anthony said, I'm actually a philosopher of mind, but I've been working on the Apprentices project for 3 years now. So this is my first sort of public venture into a bit of moral philosophy. So slightly nervous, but hopefully I'll be able to do some justice to foot, a little bit of justice to foot, I hope. And it's been really fun for me writing this paper, so I hope you enjoy it. I am reading it, so I hope I can manage to keep you engaged. You've got a handout. I will periodically draw your attention to passages that I'm going to read out. Okay, so my subject this evening is art and morality in Philippa Foot's monograph, Natural Goodness. A surprising topic, perhaps, since Foot seems not to mention this area in that mature work. Instead, we find a 1972 paper included in the 2002 collection Moral Dilemmas entitled Morality in Art, which, in the preface, Foot tells the reader she has included only hesitantly, the reason being that she was less able to speak, in her own words, more robustly of the objectivity of moral judgment there than she was in later work. It seems that such was her dissatisfaction with the paper that she didn't include it in an earlier volume of essays where, chronologically speaking, it belongs. That's Virtues and Vices from 1978. It's true that as Foot's life progressed, she came to speak more and more robustly of the objectivity of moral judgment, arriving at her most robust formulation with the conception of natural goodness that the title of her monograph refers to. The Foot archives at Somerville College contain an earlier draft called The Grammar of Goodness, a title which would have remained apt. Foot is concerned with forms of evaluative judgment, and in particular with the peculiar grammar of forms of evaluation of living things. A good deer is one that can run swiftly. A good owl is one that can see in the dark. A deer or owl that cannot do such things is defective insofar as they cannot do what creatures of their kind do. The word good applied in this way is used attributively, not predicatively. Foot jokes in a footnote that she used to explain this contrast, as I will do now, in Homage to Foot, with a scrap of torn paper. Like the adjectives large and small, the use of good in most contexts isn't intelligible independently of consideration of what the noun to which it is attributed picks out. A small elephant is only small as far as elephants go. We cannot say that it simply is small. Likewise, a scrap of torn paper like this one is not simply good or bad. Foot recalls that an offer to pass the paper around to check whether or not it is good would rouse a laugh, a recognition of the grammatical and logical absurdity. Does anyone want to check? With this invitation to check, Foot means to target a predicative use of good that G.E. Moore draws attention to in his 1903 Principia Ethica. Moore thinks that goodness is a property which is out there and which is intuitable. We can recognize and contemplate it, hence Foot's invitation to check. But goodness for Moore is non-natural. It cannot be identified with or reduced to natural properties. Instead, he lists the pleasures of human interaction and intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects as good in this predicative sense, saying that, and here's B on your handout, it is only for the sake of these things, in order that as much of them as possible may at some time exist, that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty. They are the raison d'être of virtue. By 2001, Foot had her own way of making sense of the most important reason for virtue's being. Just as a good deer needs to be swift, the good human needs the virtues. For instance, in order to do what humans do, courage is often needed, as is kindness, honesty, and as Foot emphasizes, and which many theorists leave off their list, but I think it's quite indicative of the character of her as a philosopher and the quality that comes through in her writing as well, a willingness to receive good things. The virtues are not my topic tonight, so you've had a really wonderful talk on that topic by John Hacker Wright. For now, we need only note that by natural goodness, Foot had found her way to speaking robustly of the objectivity of moral judgment because she had discovered a normativity that is natural insofar as it is necessitated by the kind of animal we are, and so is grounded neither in subjective attitudes nor in social conventions or in rules or principles of the sort that are created by our linguistic practices. But when she was writing Morality and Art in the early 70s, she was still on her journey towards robustness. So the task of that 1972 paper was to compare moral and aesthetic judgments. My task in this paper is to attempt a bit of exegetical extrapolation. By natural goodness, Foot's views on moral judgment have changed. My question is, the question I've been asking myself is, how might she have treated the comparison between moral and aesthetic judgment from that later perspective, or indeed the broad topic of art and morality at all? There are glimmers on the topic of art in natural goodness, glimmers that invite this strategy. So I'm going to lift them from the text and set out one way in which I think theorising on Foot's naturalism could go. In particular, I want to try and show that once you look at things in this way, this can help deflect a kind of criticism that can be laid against Foot of a certain kind of conservatism. So here's the plan for the paper. First, I'm going to set out that 1972 contrast, and I've given you a sort of summary of it on the handout. Then I'm going to offer a closer synopsis of Foot's later view before moving on to my constructive project in the second half of the talk. And there I'm going to set out some textual fragments from natural goodness that I think can be arranged for a tentative Footian aesthetics. And I'm going to bring them into conversation with some ideas from Iris Murdoch to elucidate what I think the import may be for Foot of depicting human form. And I'm going to demonstrate this in the last part of the talk by drawing your attention to two passages from the final pages of Natural Goodness. Okay, so this is my second section, Getting Started, Strain or Fiction. Foot starts her 1972 paper by delimiting her terrain. She says she will not ask whether moral judgments are relevant when judging art. She says she will not argue with G.E. Moore that aesthetic experience is an intrinsic good that ought to be pursued for its own sake. Like Foot, I started by mentioning Moore, but not quite to leave him aside, and I want to stay with Moore for a moment, partly because where we are in Gordon Square, and I just couldn't resist. It's well enough known that some of Moore's views on ethics and aesthetics influenced the Bloomsbury Group. In 1908, we find a letter from Virginia Woolf to Clive Bell, author of the Formalist Manifesto Art and husband of her sister, painter Vanessa Bell. So here she is on your handout C. I am splitting my head over Moore every night, feeling ideas travelling to the remotest parts of my brain and setting up a feeble disturbance hardly to be called thought. It is almost a physical feeling, as though some little coil of brain, unvisited by any blood so far, has got a little life into it at last. Literary critic Patricia Waugh comments, here I quote, "Rarely has reading analytic philosophy appeared so erotic, so close to the body." Here we have a picture of ideas being incorporated. But if Moore's aesthetics proved animating in this way, some little coil of brain has got life into it at last, the content of Moore's aesthetics, Waugh finds more eviscerated. The Moore thinks we should admire the corporeal expression of the mental qualities of those we have affection for, something Bloomsbury also went in for. His conception of aesthetic experience or consciousness is neither bodily, nor situated, nor historical. And he introduces a diagnostic at the end of the Principia in a chapter called The Ideal, which in her book, Ethics Since 1900, Mary Warnock jokes that nobody has actually literally read that chapter, but I'm going to give you a little hint of what goes on there now. Moore instructs, we are to consider things as if they existed in themselves in absolute isolation, and to ask whether their mere existence is good, good being used here in a predicative sense. Those things that survive absolute isolation, he thinks, include the states of consciousness involved in aesthetic experience and in the appreciation of what is beautiful in art or nature. Such isolationism might be thought the pinnacle of art for art's sake, a movement that Iris Murdoch discards in her 1959 paper, The Sublime and the Good, as flimsy and frivolous, and with which she associates Bloomsbury. Art is for life's sake, she writes, or else it is worthless. I'm going to show a little later to what extent and in what ways I think Foot would agree with this statement. So after leaving Moore aside, Foot shares a hunch. something that tallies with her broadly Wittgensteinian method. We often find her drawing attention to feelings of malaise, a sense of queerness that is the mark of something philosophically suspect. So recall the laugh that the scrap of paper roused. Her hunch is this, quote, "There is some element of fiction and strain in what we say about right and wrong, while our appraisal of aesthetic objects is relatively free from pretense," end quote. This is a contrast that she thinks has, in her words, something behind it. She sorts three dimensions of difference, which I'll call contingency, relativity, and inescapability, and I'm going to go through each of these briefly so that you'll have an idea of her position in 1972. So start with contingency. In the two papers from the late 50s, which made her name, Moral Arguments and Moral Beliefs, Foote urges that moral judgments are not simply subjective. They can't be likened to cries like ow or alas, or even declarative expressions like how nice, which can be sincere or insincere, but not true or false. And we want to be able to say that moral judgments are true or false. But admitting this much still leaves open what makes a given moral judgment true. Perhaps I can conjure up moral principles for myself, self-prescribe how I am to act. Foote demonstrates that such a view would allow for bizarre prohibitions against, for instance, walking up to an English door slowly. I mustn't do that. Or looking at hedgehogs by the light of the moon. Instead, morality must have some connection with securing benefit and removing harm. And to the extent that it does, it must be objective. Still, for the 1972 Foote, an uncomfortable degree of subjectivity remains, best explained by example. A conception of morality is connected with benefit and harm, fixes it that the killing of human beings is objectionable. Nonetheless, and here I quote from a footnote in the 1972 paper, quote, "There is a genuine choice as to whether or not to count as a human being with the rights of a human being what would become a human being but is not yet capable of independent life." This is an example of contingency. Though there may be fixed starting points in moral disagreement, even a definition of good and bad is connected, say, with benefit and harm, there may be play in the system, as she calls it. So she uses this word play. But where there is such play, we may wind up tracing back to and leaning on the strength of mere conviction. We may wind up wanting to say that something just is right or wrong, thereby giving the impression of some kind of authority standing behind our conviction. But here's the fiction, Foote thinks. The strain or uneasiness we may feel is the sense that there is nothing behind our just is proclamations. Aesthetic judgment is different. The notion of contingency doesn't get a foothold. It's not obvious what it could be for two people to agree on all the aesthetic facts relevant to appreciation, the starting points, and then disagree in their appreciation to the extent that discussion backtracks to bare just is statements with the spectre of some kind of authority standing behind them. Relativity. It follows from the assumption of contingency that there may be some moral judgments for which a relativistic account will be right, for where there is play, mere conviction or attitude or feeling may stand behind certain assertions. Foote gives examples of relativity from outside ethics. Clothes are said to be elegant, someone is good looking, letting yak's butter go rancid before floating it on tea gives a delicious flavour. No one will deny the relativity of such statements, says Foote. Here she quotes. I quote from her, quote, "It would be quite obviously ridiculous for us to say that our opinions about the Tibetan's tea is correct and theirs mistaken," unquote, end quote. It involves, in her words, no compromise of our own to grant that a Tibetan uttering the sentence, "rancid yak's butter gives a good flavour to tea," is saying something true. It involves no compromise of ours. But a compromise of our own is involved if we grant that it is right to do X is true when said by some person, even though were we to say it, it would be false. In the case of the flavour of tea, at least on one reading, to refuse to acknowledge that a Tibetan uttering the sentence meaning "rancid yak's butter gives a good flavour to tea" is saying something true belies, thinks Foote, a fictional belief that one's own taste is superior. The same is true in morals. In morals, we don't tend to allow a modest relativism or compromise. But where there is contingency and where compromise is ruled out, the fiction of superiority lurks nearby, something about which we may feel uneasy. In contrast, when it comes to art, if we have something to say in criticism of the art, for example, of a different age, perhaps that it's melodramatic or florid, we offer reasons in support of our claims, but we don't insist that we must somehow be right. To grant that the 18th century reader might have been saying something true in describing Samuel Richardson's Pamela as riveting involves no compromise of our own should we find the narrative voice dull and overbearing. And here Foote adds something that I find striking, and this is on your handout again. It's D. She says, this is in the context of thinking of aesthetic judgment, sometimes recognition or appreciation fails, say when judging art. But then we are increasingly likely to think of the matter like that and not to condemn what we do not understand or like. Okay. Inescapability. Inescapability is a theme that haunts Foote. We tend to think of moral judgments as committing or inescapable. For some, moral considerations are overriding. Moral judgments pertain to choice or action, something Foote thinks Hume gets right. But the amoralist is, we might say, an escapist. Where we treat moral judgments as having a kind of inescapability with respect to choice or action, he does not. Though he may recognize the demands of morality, he does not act on them. So to me, this invites a distinction with the immoralist. The immoralist does not recognize the constraints of the ethical at all. So I'm going to return to the immoralist at the end of the talk. The 1972 Foote is worried primarily about what we might say to the amoralist. We might try to convince him that he should act this way or that. What she feels, however, what Foote feels, however, is the ineptitude, the complete inefficacy of this should. For why should he? She has not yet found a form of natural necessity that grounds the real inescapability of certain moral judgments. At the moment, inescapability is felt, but without any identifiable grounds. In contrast, aesthetic judgments are escapable. We are free to retract, revisit, reframe prior leanings. Aesthetic evaluations don't pertain to action choice, and perhaps with practical rest comes a certain amount of evaluative abandon. Okay, so I'm moving on to my next section now. I've given them names for myself, so this is Bees and me. So we're about a third way through the talk, and I'm just going to recap my strategy. In Natural Goodness, Foote doesn't say anything explicit, very, very little about the relation between aesthetic and moral judgments, or indeed on the topic of art and morality at all. But her views on morality have changed. So my question is, how might she have treated the topic from a later viewpoint? Okay, so let's note in more detail what has changed by 2001 with respect to morality. Foote, I realise that some of you will be very familiar with Foote after attending these lectures. You'll be quite familiar. So, but I actually think this is still quite nice to recap because it's just nice philosophy. So here we go. Foote picks up work by Michael Thompson, itself a development of some Anscomian strands of thought. And this offers Foote a way of articulating a conception of the human life form to which she will attach her attributive good. For Thompson, the form of life of a kind of living thing is captured by a series of what he calls natural historical judgments, where these are judgments of the sort that might be narrated on a natural history TV program. So they have forms like the S have does F, S's do F. This is how things go with an S, they do F. So I've listed them on your handout. It's on the second page. For instance, swordbills have a beak longer than their body. As each long flower blooms, it gives the swordbill a fresh supply of food all to itself. Saiga antelope give birth to twins, so their numbers grow rapidly just when grass is plentiful. The glass frog leaves its eggs on stones close to waterfalls. Such statements are unquantified and non-empirical. There is no particular swordbill that has all to itself the deepest draught of nectar from the longest flowers. Often the life form term in the grammatical subject appears with the definite article, the, so we talk about the glass frog. Such judgments are also atemporal, so they're in the present tense. The saiga antelope are born when grass is plentiful. There is no particular past, present, or future time at which the saga is born. They're just atemporal, I should say, rather than in the present tense. Okay, so Foote assumes, like Thomson, that a cache of such natural historical judgments characterize the human life form, and that it's in light of that form that judgments of natural goodness or defect can be made. A good human can do what creatures of their kind do, whereas as I noted at the outset, this requires the possession of the virtues. Humans need virtues like bees need stings, Foote would say. And since practical rationality involves acting well, so as she puts it in a 2007 interview, it involves taking the right things for reasons, taking the right things as reasons, morality becomes part of practical rationality. What we have reason to do is grounded in our human nature. Now, with this new model of moral evaluation, gone, it might be thought, are the feelings of uneasiness and strain that the earlier Foote detects, replaced instead with relief and maybe even the joy of the naturalist. Humans are returned to the natural world of bees and plants. And when you're reading Natural Goodness after you've read the early work, you have that sort of feeling, I'd actually think of relief or something. But not for long. Our reflective capacities transmogrify and are essential to human ways of going on. And by the end of the book, the feeling is different, it's darker. Foote considers Nietzsche's immoralism, and she describes it as poisonous, a description I'm going to return to. For now, we might ask how relativity, contingency, and inescapability look in this new conceptual scene. Okay, so first, relativism. Relativism with respect to moral judgment no longer involves compromise. All it involves is an innocuous kind of cultural relativism, which allows that the human form of life is exemplified at different times and places and habitats even in different ways. Contingency is now transformed. The starting point for ethics is now a life form concept, human, a concept that makes relevant natural historical judgments that say how things are and ought to be with an individual of that kind. So this is an attempt to revisit my earlier example. It does not strike me that what Foote would say now, as she did in 1972, that there is a genuine choice as to whether or not to count as a human being with the rights of a human being, what would become a human being but is not yet capable of independent life. The later Foote might say, in conceiving of some bit of matter as something that can become a human being, one brings it under the concept human and lets it be the grammatical subject of natural historical judgments that together make up the natural history of the life form human. The human begins as a cluster of cells. Of course, this leaves open whether the same rights extend at the same time to every individual organism that shares in the human form of life. But it seems that it does not leave open whether this individual falls under the concept human. But critically, and as I said, that was just an attempt to recapitulate what I think Foote perhaps might have said, but what she says is, here the idiom of play survives. This idiom of play, we had it in the 1972 paper, and it survives. And she says, this is a quote from Natural Goodness, "I have very little idea of how much play there will in the end turn out to be, how many grey areas. I have very little idea. We have to keep an open mind." Okay, I return to contingency later, and with it, inescapability. So how does aesthetic judgment fare from the explanatory perspective of natural goodness? I want to say, first off, that there's no reason to think that Foote would have changed her mind about their grammar. Aesthetic judgment involves attitude and feeling. At the same time, were Foote to have revisited the themes of the 1972 paper explicitly in Natural Goodness, I can imagine that the strategy, and she always talks about strategy and argument, and I think that the strategy according to which she would have charted the comparison would have changed. And this is what I'm going to try and demonstrate next. So now we're actually halfway through the talk. In making her fresh start, this is the chapter, the name of the chapter at the beginning of Natural Goodness, Foote says that goods that hang on human cooperation also hang on such things as respect for art. It might be wondered why and how goods that hang on human cooperation also hang on art. Foote does not say what this connection could be, so I'm going to have a go. And here I'm beginning the constructive part of the paper. Elizabeth Anscombe says we have ways of getting each other to do things that does not depend on force. Promising is an example of such cooperation. While force is indexed broadly to the present, now, promising brings about its effects in the future. Anscombe calls the kind of necessity that promising brings about Aristotelian necessity. Foote mentions self-interest as an Aristotelian necessity. Self-interest is necessary for humans since, once grown, we are better placed than anyone else to look out for our futures and for ourselves. So it's interesting, self-interest is an Aristotelian necessity. The word time does not occur in the index of natural goodness. Care for the future is, I think, a kind of virtue for Foote. Sensitivity to time and a suitable kind of temporal orientation for oneself, one's children or dependents is, I think, part of natural goodness, as is, we might imagine, care for the form of life itself and the variety of ways in which it can be instanced at places. She often mentions hope. Further, although atemporal, natural historical judgments contain time references to temporal phases of various sorts: circadian, seasonal, developmental. At night, the mongoose forages. In spring, the black bear lazes by its den. The human infant puts objects into its mouth. These temporal phrases and words are, we might say, part of the superficial grammar that articulates a life cycle, but this is distinct from having a kind of orientation in time that is part of the life form itself and which the natural historical judgments that characterize the life form collectively express or show. So with this notion of an Aristotelian necessity in sight, we might ask, does art involve a way of getting people to do things that does not depend on force, where this may involve respect for the normative status of art? I'm going to draw on Iris Murdoch's aesthetics to defend this possibility, though the idea I want to explore is slightly different, if compatible. It's the idea not that we have ways of getting people to do things that depends on art, but that we have ways of getting each other to see things that depends on art, where seeing for Murdoch is a precursor to doing. Murdoch writes that we can only act in the world that we can see. So in Murdoch's aesthetics, we find at least two ways of homing in on the idea that we have ways of getting each other to see things, which hangs on art. So first, let's return to Gordon Square at an earlier time, and back to Virginia Woolf. In her old essay, Old Bloomsbury in Moments of Being, Woolf depicts a way of going on that was characteristic of the members of the Bloomsbury group at that moment in their lives, but which is rather mundane and familiar and which we partly exemplify now too. So here is the passage that I'm interested in. It's G on your handout. We sat and looked at the ground. Then at last, Vanessa, having said that she had been to some picture show, incautiously used the word beauty. At that, one of the young men would lift his head slowly and say, "It depends what you mean by beauty." At once all our ears were pricked. It was as if the bull had been turned into the ring. The bull might be beauty, might be good, might be reality. Whatever it was some abstract question that now drew all our forces. Often we would still be sitting in a circle at 2 or 3 in the morning. So Murdoch sees the kind of triangulation that exists between at least two individuals, here a group, and an artwork, here a picture show, as having a kind of epistemic significance. Words are used in contexts. I can learn something about your scheme of concepts in the context of a shared object of attention. For instance, with reference to the picture show, I can learn something about what you think is mediocre or ingenious or derivative, since you will help me see where and why, for you, such words apply. We can thereby get the measure of where we diverge and overlap. So Anil Gomes has a really wonderful paper on this topic that gives flesh to the bones of this idea, so I recommend that. Second, Murdoch gives a certain explanatory role to the form of the artwork. For instance, the novel, a narrative artwork, yokes together elements from our shared form of life in a coherent way. And if it is great art for Murdoch, it will be realistic. Realism in art, like realism more generally, is for Murdoch a moral achievement. But in this respect, the great artwork is for Murdoch, and this is my way of framing things, a bit like a lens. In depicting passions of human life in a realistic way, those passions are made more salient to us when we turn away from fiction to reality. They come to stand out. They are lifted out of the maelstrom of existence, otherwise full of contingency and seeming to lack point. And if it is great art, it will foreground, now using Foote's idiom, what is serious and not trivial in human life, though this is not to say that what is serious cannot be found in the most humdrum realities. So I'm happy to speak more about the serious and trivial in questions. Yet, if great art is like a lens for Murdoch, and to be clear, this is my way of framing things again, it's also like a mirror. The artwork, she says, is a cracked object, and here she is in passage H on your handout, writing about the novel in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. The novel is a discursive art. The novel, in the great 19th century sense, attempts to envisage, if not the whole of life, at any rate a piece of it large and varied enough to seem to illuminate the whole, and has most obviously an open texture, a porous or cracked quality. The object is, as it were, I just love this, full of holes through which it communicates with life, and life flows in and out of it. This openness is compatible with elaborate form. The thing is open in the sense that it looks towards life and life looks back. So it would take time to adequately explore this passage, but for now I only want to suggest that it chimes with perhaps the most quoted of lines in Murdoch's entire philosophical corpus. And that's the sentence which I'm sure you've heard a few times, those of you who have been regular attendees of these lectures. Man is a creature who makes pictures and then comes to resemble those pictures. So this is from her Metaphysics and Ethics, which was published the same year as Anscombe's Intention. It's also a statement that at once recalls the form of the natural historical judgment. Man is a creature who makes pictures. The S does F. Making pictures is something we humans do, where picture may be read on a cultural or historical scale to involve myth. The epic pictures we need but can be held captive by, a theme Mary Midgley's meta-philosophy constantly and brilliantly returns to. And then comes to resemble those pictures. This is how things go with an S. They do F. Of course, we might wonder what it is to resemble a picture, and again, there is much to say. For now, I will only note that resembling cannot mean copying, which would involve interpretation and the possibility of mistake. In her long essay or short book, The Fire and the Sun, Murdoch, writing on the Timaeus, comments, I don't know if I've pronounced that right. A good man, this is a quote, a good man does not copy another good man playing him as an actor plays a role. And arguably her own philosophy agrees. The only sense in which one can copy a villain is by performing instances of actions that are villainous. But if so, resembling a picture is not a matter of copying, it is a matter of being what is depicted. And here we might be reminded of the closeness of Foote's thought to Moore, its incorporation. There's a slightly longer quote from Murdoch on your handout, which you can look at later. Returning to Foote then, I think we can so far light on a negative claim, but first I need to add a further detail to the picture that I'm trying to assemble. In 1972, Foote says that in cases of good conduct, benefit does not usually accrue to oneself, or at least self-benefit is irrelevant. And it's precisely this fracturing of benefit from which the amoralist wants to escape. In contrast, the fruits of good art are garnered by the one to whom the good, the interest and the enjoyment of the artwork will come. But from the perspective of natural goodness, elaborated in this Murdochian frame, this no longer seems to be the case. The goods of art range wider. This might at once be thought to point to a crude functional account of art, so the propensity of formal artworks to hone our attentive capacities, to allow for the coordination of divergent evaluative perspectives and so on. This might suggest too that art is at best only of instrumental value, but Foote, I think, offers us a distinctive way of conceiving this relation, and this is the second glimmer that I want to shore up from natural goodness. It's easy to overlook natural goodness, Foote thinks, because we make so many evaluations of non-living things in the natural world. She notes the soil and weather, but also artefacts made by animals, the nests of birds and beavers' dams, and in the human case, houses and bridges. But the goodness of these things, she thinks, is only secondary. Their goodness is only intelligible in the context of the life form in which they play a part. So the goodness of a beaver's dam is only intelligible as good in the context of the form of life that the beaver participates in. Okay, so here's a quote from Foote, talking about things that have secondary goodness. She says, they contribute to the way things can go on in the life of the species. So I think it's tempting to see art, if not quite having the artifactual status of at least many houses and bridges, then as expressions of our creative capacity that are at least akin to these things. But if so, we can think of art too as possessing a kind of secondary goodness. Some clarifications. Importantly, evaluations of secondary goodness when applied to art or representation are not quite aesthetic evaluations, though evaluation of aesthetic quality or artistic value may be a component feature of the assessment of secondary goodness. Nor is such evaluation straightforwardly suggestive of an ethicism or aestheticism about art. I've listed those on your handout at J. Ethicism is just very, very broadly the idea that the moral outlook endorsed by an artwork is relevant to its aesthetic evaluation. In aestheticism, there is no such link. Whether Foote would hold either of these, I cannot say. I suspect the latter. But at any rate, the evaluation of secondary goodness is evaluation of a different kind. Things that have secondary goodness contribute to how things go in the life of the species. I think we can leave it highly indeterminate how art contributes to how things go in the life of the human animal. That things do go some way or other, however, brings into view the third comment I want to consider. So, like I said, these are really tiny little fragments that you get from reading Natural Goodness. They're buried quite deeply. In evaluating how things contribute to how things go in the life of the species, we're concerned with the life form as it is now, not with how it could be. For one, the idea that the human life form itself could be better or worse assumes the predicative use of good that Foote wants to head off. Besides, she also tells us, here using the language of art, it is only insofar as stills can be made from the moving picture of the evolution of the species that we can have a natural history of a particular kind of living thing at all. And here she comments on what she sees as a gap in Michael Thompson's account. The gap she sees is this. Not just any proposition that has the natural historical form, let's say, the superficial grammar of such judgments, should figure in the set of natural historical judgments that tell us how a good X should be. Here's her example. The work is just full of beautiful examples. So the blue tit has a round blue patch on its head. But supposing blue tits being so coloured plays no part in the life of the blue tit, the grey-headed blue tit in my garden need not be defective. On this understanding, what plays a part is just what is needed to live the life of a particular kind of thing. What's needed is what's needed to live the life of a particular kind of thing. And here Foote shows us that there can, in fact, be some play in the system. A creature that can live the life of a blue tit need not have a blue-coloured head. Likewise, there can be many different ways in which what is needed to live the life of a particular kind of thing can be met. Now, these 2 points, I think, help waylay the charge of a certain kind of conservatism that can be laid against Foote. For instance, in a recent and illuminating paper by Tom Wyman, he writes that Foote articulates a notion of the human good as univocal and, quote, ultimately unchanging, something that every human being who has ever existed is subject to in ethical reflection in exactly the same way. But Foote, I think, allows for change. There is the still and there is the moving picture, and she allows for variation. The natural historical judgments that go to make up the still must have teleological import, but what is needed to live the life of a particular kind of thing can be met in different ways. It seems then we can finally circle back to inescapability and contingency. We now have an explanation for the inescapability we may feel with respect to moral judgment. To act well, even if we don't on an occasion, issues from our human nature. And this explains too in what way contingency is transformed. At the same time, once we admit the Murdochian natural historical judgment into the still that constitutes our natural history, this picture becomes complicated. For just as a characteristic kind of orientation in time is expressed or shown by our natural history, so does it contain a latent dynamism which hangs on the pictures we make of ourselves and on their secondary goodness. So in the last part of the talk, I want to draw these ideas together by glossing some of Foote's closing remarks in Natural Goodness. So this is the last section, Depicting Human Form. Earlier I said that Foote describes Nietzsche's doctrines as poisonous. In what way are they poisonous? According to Nietzsche's view as cast by Foote, there are no right or wrong actions considered in themselves. But here, and I want to let Foote's voice take over, so this is K on your handout. Human life, unlike the life of animals, is lived according to norms that are known and taken as patterns by those whose norms they are. So we have to teach children what they may and may not do. The norms to be followed must be largely formulated in terms of the prohibition of actions such as murder or theft. Unlike the members of other species, humans, having the power of abstract thought, can consider their own ways of going on. We humans have ourselves developed and can criticize our own practices. We can ask whether human life might be better conducted if Nietzsche's doctrines were taught. But then we must think about human life, about how human life could be carried on. The norms to be followed that involve prohibition are what Anscombe calls stopping modals, and I know Candice Vogler and Rachel Wiseman spoke to you about these. They are of the form, you mustn't do X, you can't do X, where X may be filled in by something that it is in the power of a human animal to do, thieve or lie or murder even. Mary Midgley writes in her 1973, The Concept of Beastliness, that where murder is so easy, a species must have a rigorous inhibition against it or perish. She's writing of wolves. Humans need rules. That adults teach children such norms is then part of our natural history, and again, a certain kind of orientation in time is expressed by our instructing our children in this way. But since living according to such norms is what we humans do, a human that flouts them is, by Foote's lights, defective. A Nietzschean immoralist is, however, more than defective. Since it is part of human life that norms expressed using stopping modals are taught to children, a view that doesn't treat the actions that can take the place of X as prohibited in themselves would be, were that view taken up, inimical to the human form of life going on. It is in this sense then that I think Foote might characterize Nietzsche's doctrines as poisonous. They fail to have a secondary goodness. So I have so far cast the Wittgensteinian frame of Foote's thinking on these matters in terms of epistemic feelings, hunches, feelings of malaise, but in this final page, it's actually the final page of Natural Goodness, to me there are plain echoes of the rule-following argument. The possibility of human life going on is internal to the human life form itself. So does this mean finally that we should not countenance poisonous doctrines or, as Hume would cast it, morally vicious artworks? A question Foote explicitly does not broach in her 1972 paper. She says she's not going to address that question. I'm not sure if Foote would say so from the perspective of natural goodness, but in a postscript, she gives an example which might suggest that the taking of certain kinds of objects as objects of aesthetic appreciation is defective. I'm happy to talk about the distinction between evaluation and appreciation in questions, but here is the passage, it's the last one on the handout. Goethe told his secretary Eckermann of a certain Englishman who, owning an aviary, was so struck one day by the beautiful appearance of a dead bird that he straightway had the rest killed and stuffed. Hardly a crime, and yet there was something wrong with that man. For a Moorian isolationist, The mere existence of states of aesthetic appreciation is good, and the more of such states that exist as killing the rest might engender, the better. The problem with absolute isolationism, however, is that it demands that the work be dehistoricized. But more critically, it also assumes that the act of contemplation of such isolated objects is itself dehistoricized, floating free from any background. And perhaps the evaluative escapability of aesthetic judgment tempts this picture. And this, I think, is what Foote might have found dangerous. Works of art and philosophical doctrines appear against a background. They are Murdochian cracked objects, full of holes. They look towards life, and life looks back. Foote is writing against a background where the aesthetic pull of Nietzsche's depictions of human form were mirrored in the historical events that she took as the background for all of her philosophy from 1946 on, and she too recognises their allure. But she also recognises her task as philosopher. Again, feelings creep in. When criticising Nietzsche, she feels herself a surveyor reducing a glorious countryside to its contours. Or, quote, like someone telling the sirens they are singing out of tune. But like Midgley, Anscombe and Murdoch, she sees that this is work that needs to be done. If art is for life's sake, then so is philosophy. Or, to paraphrase Foote, we were seduced once, who's to say we will not be again? Thank you.